So hello everybody, my name is Christopher Tompkins. I'm very happy that all of you could join us on such short notice. This hour-long exchange or interchange is a general introduction both to the work that I'm engaged in and also to the particular course that is coming up. And for those of you that are downloading this after the fact, to the course that is now available, and that is the online interactive immersion that we're calling The Rise of Tantra and the Origins of Hatha Yoga. That is to say, how it is that what we think of now as Hatha Yoga has its origins within the Tantric movement, but more specifically, what is this yoga all about? What did it look like in its original initiatory phase? That is to say, what is it about this particular form of specialized yoga, as the Tantrics called it, that led to the establishment of this very, very novel, innovative movement of spiritual practice and philosophy throughout all of India that we now know as the Tantric movement or the tradition of Tantric Shaivism. So this is both an introduction to that theme that is covered in the course and a general introduction to Tantra in general, in a more sort of widespread sense. So towards the second half of this period together, we'll be looking at some questions that have come in terms of the basics of the Tantric tradition, questions perhaps on Tantric yoga, and joining me for that will be Ina Sahaja, who will be reading off questions that you all have posted on Facebook and in emails and so forth over the last couple of days. So what I want to begin with is a bit of a background into this tradition itself, again in a general sense, and also into what has drawn me as a teacher, as a scholar, but mostly as I like to think of myself as an ongoing student of the tradition, one who has made the promise, you might say, to share these incredibly life-changing teachings with all of you, and hopefully to help reestablish isn't quite the right word, but reintroduce to us this very misaligned, misunderstood tradition that we call Tantra, and also the novel, innovative practices that form the very yoga that it brought to us, a yoga that was deemed to be so powerful that this movement was the first to guarantee spiritual liberation, whatever that means, but spiritual liberation within one lifetime, within a single life. And first of all, I want to look at that and then look at my background into this tradition, or share that, and then look into the definition of Tantra as it's been given to us by the Tantras themselves, with the understanding in advance that this is not a tradition, though it's been much misunderstood, this is not a tradition that is vague or uncertain, and that is meant to be approached from several different perspectives. My argument is that it is not. It is a tradition that made promises with its innovative practices, that inspired countless souls who were initiated into this movement while it lasted in the South Indian continent, or South Asian continent, India and beyond, for over 1,000 years. What is novel about this system is that it offers a particular form of practice in terms of its ritualized yoga that, unlike any system of yoga that had come before, guarantees liberation within one lifetime. This is its claim to fame, what is called the Vishesha Shastra, the specialized revelation of this tradition. And I want to read a quote from an early Tantric text to that effect. This is what defines the tradition according to the tradition itself, not according to what I say, but what the tradition says about itself. Right? Yata Shruti Smriti Purana Sama Nrashri Mata Kamika Adyo Vishesha Shastram, just as the Shruti, or the ancient Vedic revelation, or the Smriti, the human-authored philosophical text that came after the original hymns to the gods, or the Puranas, the mythological texts of ancient India, just as the Shruti, Smriti, and Puranas, or the ancient systems of Hinduism and their particular forms of yoga practice, give an ordinary revelation, our source tells us. The revered scriptures, such as the Kamika Tantra, but the revered scriptures, the revered revelations of the Tantric movement, constitute what is called, or what we call as Tantrics, the Vishesha Shastra, the specialized revelation. This comes from the mouth of the anonymous author of the Mrigendra Padati Tika, or the commentary of a manual on tantric practice, right? Commenting on the Mrigendra Tantra from about the 7th or 8th century AD. So, what we're talking about then is that the specialized revelation is centered within the performance of two fundamental rituals that are utterly particular to the tantric movement. And these rituals are namely the ritual of initiation, that of Nirvana Diksha, or the initiation Diksha, that promises, at least eventually, that through its performance, one will reach the state of nirvana. This is a code word for liberation that the Buddhists perhaps made famous. But nirvana means literally blown out. What is blown out in this case? Not one's life, but one's chitta vritti, or the mental turbulence that keeps us focused in states of contraction and blocks the omniscient, omnipresent, blissful nature of the awakened self. And this ritual, which is performed, or was performed, in all tantric lineages, leads to, or paves the way for, a daily yoga practice which has at its basis the fundamental power of sacred sound as a liberating factor. And this is a practice of daily yoga that comes to be known as Hatha yoga. That is to say, a series of practices that are yogic in nature, that concern pranayama phases or kramas, that concern visualizations of subtle body phenomena such as lotuses and chakras and nadis, and most of all, engage a powerful form of practice in which the deities themselves, what we think of as the gods and goddesses, particularly the goddesses, are no longer outside of ourselves, but they are internal liberating powers that come to us in the form of sacred resonance known as seed mantras. And these mantras are engaged with breath pauses, with kumbhaka, with visualizations, dhyana, installed ritually. And ritually, ritual's the key term here, installed as liberating powers that free us from stuck energies that have been contained in the body, in the subtle body, from lifetimes worth of karmic trauma, of judgments, of states of contraction that have not been healed, that we literally store, it is understood, we literally store unhealed traumas of the past and unhealed contractions of consciousness that we've died with perhaps in other lives, that this is all stored as an actual subtle substance. And don't take my word for it, or the tantric's word for it. If you've ever had a moment in your yoga practice in which you felt a sudden liberation from something stuck in your emotional, physical body, something that's sprung loose perhaps that leads to a moment of emotion, a release, then we know that we store dis-ease in the body. So the working of these mantras that the tantric tradition brings us in its novel form of yoga, the working of these mantras, in addition to yogic practices that had been known before the tantric period, but now coalescing these into one daily ritual performed in order to expunge all the stuck blockages in the central channel of the subtle body. This is what is called mantra sadhana, or mantra sadhana is good. Mantra nyasa, invoking mantras that are the actual deities. So when we chant these seed mantras, such as the universal source mantra, composed of all the vowels of the Sanskrit alphabet in a composite single syllable, ah, oo, hung, we're chanting the om syllable that clears this pathway. Well, that om syllable is known as Parashakti, the supreme power. This is the internalized goddess power that is invoked in order to clear the central channel of all that is in the way of one's own naturally awakened state. This is the ubiquitous, widespread, fundamental promise of the Tantrics. No other system provided a means of working with mantras to completely clear out all the karmic blockages of this life and others, to leave one in the naturally awakened state of one's own self, state of self-recognition. So this is its fundamental Vishesha Shastra, or the specialized revelation, that this yoga of adding the fundamental practice of seed vibrations to break up stuck energy in the body defines the tradition, and is imbued within its two rituals. I mentioned them already, the first one more particular being the initiation ritual, in which the guru, and by the way, this system of Tantra, as we call it, was known to itself as the path of mantras, the mantra marga, and it included both men and women initiates. It included householders. In fact, it celebrated the householder life. Unlike every single tradition that precedes the Tantric movement that began around the 5th century AD in earnest, all systems that had a form of yoga practice were basically life negating, that one must not be a householder, one must take to the forest or to the cave, within inside of a mountain, in which to completely disengage from the sensual life, particularly from sex and particularly from women. Now in the Tantric movement, we have a householder practice where you keep your day job, where we have matriarchal gurus who are initiating as well as practicing, and we have a whole innovative approach to life in which this body, far from being a nasty tube of meat, as it's described in the ancient Upanishads, from which Patanjali mainly draws his Yoga Sutra, instead of being a tube of meat filled with nasty fluids, this body now is seen as a divine wave on the ocean of supreme consciousness, or Shiva. It is the vehicle to liberation itself. And this practice, in which we cultivate the liberated state, not by going for a goal in our future, but by literally unlearning, peeling back, as it were, or dissolving the blockages that obscure us from who we really are. So this daily yoga that later becomes known by cliched phrases such as Hatha Yoga, originally called itself the Antar Yoga, A-N-T-A-R-Y long A-G-A. Antar Yoga is a beautiful phrase. It means internal ritual. And it's a daily ritual, a nitya puja, one in which ritual is not seen as a means to an end in terms of gratifying some version of God or goddess out there, but it is the daily ritual in which we see this body, this incarnation, beyond the post-it notes of self-judgment, but in terms of a sacred vehicle for ritual transformation, in which every day I stand the chance to awakening to who I truly am fully. No other system has ever proposed that liberation can be achieved while living. This is called Jivan Mukti in Sanskrit, except for ancient Buddhism. But ancient Buddhism, pre-Tantra of course, or what we call Theravada or Hinayana Buddhism, also teaches that you must say no to life. You must abscond from daily engagement as a householder and become a monk. The difference between these two systems is that here we have a householder movement in which we keep our day job, and this points to a really fundamental point that, or a rubric that's been asked of me a lot. What's the difference between the yoga or the approach to life of the Tantrics versus the systems that have come before? It's not so much that there's a big difference, other than the fact that the Tantrics utilize these ancient philosophies and yoga practices, and very much in a pyramid fashion have built on what we have seen before, have renovated the doctrine, for instance, of life denying into something life affirming, and have added to or refined the yoga practices to be a choreographed system of ritualized practices that have that fundamental goal of creating liberation from stuck, unhealed energy in this body. This is the revelation of this movement in a nutshell. And so this is what we'll be talking about and unpacking a lot in the course, from the point of view not of me, I see myself as the transmitter, as a student, but rather from the fundamental texts themselves. What do the texts claim for themselves? And so hopefully in this little preview I've been able to show, or at least suggest, that this tradition is not some hodgepodge of different practices. It is very specific. It calls itself a specialized revelation in which its yoga is so powerful. It's mantra-based, innovative yoga, which we've never seen before, where mantra deities become the liberating powers that are activated by the practitioner. This has never happened in any system prior to Tantric, well, I should say Shaiva Tantric Yoga, or Tantric Shaivism. A, and B, it is the first system to guarantee liberation within one lifetime while living in the state of as a householder, engaging in life in a normal, ordinary way as an awakened being. So, in terms of why I'm choosing to bring these teachings forth, I mean, the short answer is this was the last prescription of my father, who had become a very, very advanced tantric yogi, although he wouldn't put it that way. He utilized a modified form of this mantra sadhana, that is to say a pranayama-based practice that we now know is called uchara, a fundamental term that captures the revelatory mantra-based practice of the tantrics is called uchara, U-C-C-H, long A, R-A, and this means the ascent or the rise of Kundalini Shakti in the form of uncoiling sound that is generated out of moments of breath pause. And my father utilized this practice, as it was known to him in a modified form, to the point in which he was able to create a tremendous healing power in his body, and many of his, in fact, nearly all of his family and friends at the end of his life declared that he was in a state of complete awakening before he exited his body. So I grew up with these novel mantra-based practices that in his tradition were called Kriya Yoga, which just means the yoga of activity. But really, that phrase is modeled after this Tantric Uchara practice. And he told me that this practice, as he knew it in his lifetime, was not complete, and that he believed that if I dug deep enough into the Tantric texts, the scriptures, I would find the core components of this sound-based yoga. And indeed I have. I spent 5 years, according to the will of my own Sanskrit gurus, unpacking the daily ritual yoga practice that was performed, indeed was required of all tantric initiates, and was guaranteed to create liberation within one life. And I spent 5 years, sometimes 40 hours a week, pouring through hundreds of source tantras in order to get to the answers. What was this yoga all about? What was the ritual sequence? Sorry, I might have had a blip there. What was the ritual sequence in which these practices were performed? Why is it that they were lost to us? This is a sort of simpler question. Mainly, they were lost to us because of foreign invasion, which made the performance of these rituals, in the public anyway, illegal by the 14th century. So what we've inherited, just say this briefly for now, is a hodgepodge collection or a list of bulleted sections within what are called Hatha Yoga manuals of the Hatha Yoga practices innovated by the Tantrics in their daily rituals. What we've not had until now, what we're about to have when I'm done with my writing this winter here on sabbatical, is a full-blown layout of what was the daily Tantric yoga ritual prescribed to all initiates. What was the sequence? What did those practices consist of? How were they choreographed together? And this is what's been lost to us. The Hatha Yoga manuals simply have the practices listed like bullet points in, perhaps the best analogy is the cliff notes we read before exams in college that summarize the reading for the semester. Well, the problem is the Hatha Yoga manuals, many of which have been translated into English, unfortunately some of the poorer ones in terms of retaining the original Sanskrit or the original practices, such as the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, Kairanda Samhita, and Shiva Samhita. Valuable stuff in there, but none of them give the vinyasa. That is to say, how were these practices performed and what sequence and for what particular mini purposes and what was the ultimate purpose for them, other than obviously liberation. That is to say, what are we trying to cultivate? What is the sequence? This has been lost to us. So what we'll be sharing in this course, called The Rise of Shakti, the origins of Hatha Yoga, is for the first time from the source text, the actual original vinyasa of these practices. What were they? How are they done? And this will, of course, be supported by a general overview of what exactly defines the yoga tradition. So I'll be unpacking a lot more of what I've given in brief here today. So from there, or at this point, we'll see what kind of questions we may have from all of you that have come in the last couple of days.
All right. Hi, Chris.
Hello, Ina Saj, yogini and Sanskrit scholar herself.
Hello,
Very
everybody.
grateful to have you with us. Maybe we could bring you a little closer so this mic picks you up.
I think.
Is that good? Okay.
I hope. The first question came in a few days ago, and I think you touched on it, but it's also really relevant. So maybe I'd like for you to answer a little more directly if you can. Do you answer any of these questions, all of these questions, by your personal experience or by a book of your teachers? Or do you consider yourself a textbook teacher on Tantra, or are you a practitioner, or are you both?
Great question. This is great for me on many levels, because I do want to make it clear that both aspects come into play. That is to say, number one, I'm a practitioner. I grew up as a meditator. My father had me reading the ancient scriptures of India, Bhagavad Gita, Yoga Sutra, the Hindu Upanishads, the Buddhist sutras, really by the time I was 14, 15 years old. And he had me practicing a very powerful form of meditation, which gradually led to being initiated into a form of this Uchara sound practice. But I did not realize that this Uchara practice, or this Kriya Yoga as my father knew it, was from a tradition known as Tantra. It wasn't until later, when I went to grad school, that I discovered the Tantric tradition, having read the Spandakarikas, a wonderful text, which in English means the stanzas on the vibration of consciousness, the immanence of the divine all around us, a text that alludes to sacred mantra practices that were very curious to me, because I realized that they seem very similar to what I'd been doing. So I became a scholar. I'd been studying Sanskrit for 13, 14 years. I've had several Sanskrit teachers at Harvard, UC Berkeley, a couple even in India. And at this point now, I'm really seeking to homologize the two together, bringing in my experience as a practitioner. To this day, I practice Uchara regularly. I even guinea pig myself in terms of the refined practices I'm discovering and translating in the Tantras. I do so carefully, of course. And I share with students the fundamental basics of these lost Hatha Yoga practices in a modified form that doesn't overload the nervous system, particularly with mantras, but is enough to give them a taste and an inkling to what kind of joys, the joys of self-awakening, lie within them.
So I'm going to skip a few questions down because you kind of led right into it. It sounds like mantra is a huge component of these practices. And will we be learning and practicing these mantras in this immersion?
So, great question. In this immersion, we're going to have 2 to 3 practice sessions. These will be videoed live. So we'll be able to actually see a couple of core components that would be a little bit hard to follow if it was just an audio recording. That is to say, some of the seated pranayama mantra practices that form the basis of this key term that I hope becomes for you a householder, well, literally householder term, uchara. So we'll be looking at how certain bandhas are generated at the same time as sacred breath pauses, visualizations of the heart lotus opening and closing, particular visualizations also, and how to orient ourselves to the flowing power of the lunar and solar currents of breath, and most importantly, how these mantras are enunciated, these seed mantras, and how they're generated at the base of the spine but activated at the heart. Generated at the base of the spine but activated at the heart center, through the choreographed practices that we now know as Hatha Yoga. So we're looking at visuals of Ina and I practicing this system so that you can follow live or through the downloaded recording.
Great, thanks. Next question is, can you elaborate on this definition of Tantra? What differentiates authentic Tantra from other forms of Tantra that are taught out there?
Right, so referring, I guess you mean back to the definition I gave earlier. Yeah, I defined it, or rather I quoted a definition in which, and this is fundamental to my research, that the Tantrics are very clear in differentiating their system of ritualized yoga from those of prior systems. I mentioned the Vedic system, I mentioned the Smriti, which means the philosophical systems of ancient India. They don't say that they're different. This is a key point. They say, we as Tantrics offer you a specialized version of the yoga that has come before. So that's not the same thing as saying a new yoga, because they do adopt the fundamental practices of the Yoga Sutra. So we have, for instance, in the Yoga Sutra, which dates to about the 4th century AD, only 150 years or so before the earliest Tantras come on the scene. Patanjali gives us the 8 limbs, or the 8 angas of yoga, the Ashtanga system of pranayama, for instance, dhyana, dharana, that is to say, breath regulation or breath extension, pranayama, dharana, which means, for the Tantrics, placing or invoking a seed deity mantra, right, to work with in practice. Dhyana, for the Tantrics, is now specialized to mean a visualization. I'm creating a visualization that goes with my pranayama. Whereas for Patanjali, dhyana meant basically directing one's focus in the initial state of concentration into something a little more specific, where the object and the perceiver start to become one in the act of perception. For the Tantrics, it's much more technical, but much more proficient and clear. That is to say, we're working with installing seed mantras. Now, they're using the same terms, but the Tantrics call themselves specialized because they're saying that, yes, we're going to take these yoga practices, but we've refined them and added the all too powerful, or a wonderfully powerful addition of uchara, sound practices, to create a more powerful result of the yoga that has come before us. And therefore, we are specialized. Our movement is defined, our tantric movement is defined as, or we call it, the mantra marga. We are the path of mantras. They did not call themselves tantrics for the most part, occasionally. But the word tantra refers to their sacred revelations. Now, the difference between these tantric movements and what we might call neo-tantra is quite simple. This came to me, and I can explain it by example. I was presenting on one of the lineages that we're going to cover in depth in our immersion weekend together next month in February, on the Krama lineage. I was presenting on this in Sao Paulo, Brazil some years ago, and a journalist for the local yoga journal came and wanted to interview me, so we waited till after this presentation. And as you'll find out next month, the Krama is nothing other than, for the most part, a collection of ecstatic poetry of men and women. Unfortunately, we've only uncovered the poetry of the men, but matriarchal lineage of tremendous celebration of what it's like to live in a state known as Jivan Mukti, state of living liberation. So I gave this presentation, at the end of which this journalist said, that was fantastic. I had no idea that Tantra was about this ecstatic pro-life experience of liberation while in a body. And she was touched by the poetry. And she said, we have a Tantra teacher here in Brazil, and all he keeps talking about is sexual practice. How do I declare to my readers that this guy came down here, this Tompkins guy, and is giving practices of authentic Tantra versus what's taught here? And a light bulb went off over my head, and I realized the answer is this tradition is by and large not an oral tradition. That's to say that the power of the Tantric movement lies in its sacred written revelations, the Tantras. And if it's not being quoted from or paraphrased in an actual Tantra, it is by default dubious. Be careful. So what we see out in the tantric world, in terms of neo-tantra, there might be practices that are effective, but they are not tantric by definition unless they derive from actual tantras. And that's what we're here to show, is what is taught in the tantras themselves, most of which has not been revealed to us. And my last point before concluding this answer is that most of the books written on Tantra, with the exception of a book being passed to me, most of the books ever written on Tantra contain very little quotations from tantric texts. One of the exceptions to the rule is Harish Wallace's Tantra Illuminated, which draws from the primary tantric sources in giving us an overview of Tantra. This is a book that I'll be referring to in my course for further in-depth study. It's a very big book, but this online course will serve as an overview of a lot of what's in this book, but also a lot of my own work, particularly on tantric yoga.
All right. Another question that comes up is, why is it important to draw from these original source texts? How is that different from other texts or inferred translations that are out there?
Well, what's quintessential to answering this question is realizing that by definition, a Tantra is not really a philosophical text. We often think of Tantra as a philosophy, but actually what we have in terms of tantric philosophy are really what the human enlightened masters write in their treatises that are based on the practices or what their own illuminations that have occurred from the practices given in the Tantras. So a Tantra by definition is allegedly a divinely revealed scripture or revelation that comes from the mouth of Shiva or Shakti, personifications of divine consciousness, divine energy. So what is in the Tantras? What is in the Tantras are very particular prescriptions, very, very specific krama vinyasas, that is to say, sequential practices outlined in a certain in a certain sequence that one is meant to engage in that sequence. If they're done out of sequence, then the effect is either nil or it's diminished. So if we don't follow what's in those tantras, we stand a very good chance of working an adulterated system of yoga that is not going to have the promised result that is in the tantras. If we take a neo-tantric interpretation of a core tantric text, we are very likely to falter in terms of actually following the practice as it's originally intended.
Cool. Thanks, Chris.
You got it.
While you have a sip of water, I just want to say that the Rise of Tantra, this immersion you keep referring to, is February 23rd and the 24th. And the classes are going to be spread over 2 days. Each day will have two 2-hour classes with a break in the middle, totaling 8 hours of instruction. And the whole weekend will be recorded and available to view afterwards for those who would like to join but can't commit to being there live for the whole time. And also important to know is that you're still running an early bird discount of $149 if we sign up before tomorrow. So
right.
Got a couple hours. And then the price goes up. So I just want to say that for people that are out there enjoying this call and wanting to know more.
Thank you.
Okay, next question. I like this question because some people out there have done a lot of stuff with you already. So this comes from Mark in San Diego. I've taken your previous online classes and love them. How will this next class be different?
Great question. How will this next class be different? The difference is that what I've done so far in terms of the online courses, not all have been tantric, but most have. These classes have centered on a particular tantric text. I've done immersions now online with the Vijnana Bhairava Tantra, the Spandakarikas, Hraswanatha Swabodhodaya Manjari, the flowering forth of one's own awareness. These are all particular nuanced Kashmiri-based texts on Tantra that give us an overview, or at least a skip through the basic practices of Tantra. Skip not meaning omit, but like sort of traverse quickly through. But don't give a full-blown sense of A, what the tradition is all about by definition, the tantric tradition, nor do they B, give a full-blown overview, a full-blown revelation of the daily tantric yoga vinyasa. So I have spent a little bit of time in each of these online courses giving you, the audience, an overview of the daily tantric ritual. But if you notice in the recordings, if you choose to review them again or download them for the first time, you'll notice that I always say we're going to have an upcoming course someday in which we actually go through the full tantric yoga vinyasa instead of briefly alluding to it in these courses. Also, I've never given a full-blown overview of the beauty, the power, the innovation of this movement. The first movement to include women as practitioners and gurus. Again, the first movement to focus on the householder life. The first movement to embrace the body as a vehicle to liberation. And in fact, this is the first movement to include, even though we're still doing research on this, to include postural vinyasa as a preparation for these daily seated sound-based subtle body practices. We've inherited, in essence, the preparational practice, the vinyasa of what we call karanas, standing poses, asanas, seated poses, which, even though the jury's still out on this, appear to be either practices that were done through a spontaneous sahaja expression of one's own liberation through doing these mantras. We would get up and dance and move in flowing postural vinyasas, or gradually it seems to be the case that postural yoga was brought in as a preparation of working these practices of postures to purify the physical body to prepare us to sit for the seated subtle practices. I've never actually gone over all this in depth, provided the evidence for what's in the tantras, and defined the tradition as a whole as a Vishesha Shastra, specialized revelation. So this is hardcore. We're going deep, folks, into the poetry, the dynamism, the definition, and the practice of what authentic Tantra really was and is.
Wow, it's really exciting that this is going to be live video, which is different than what you've offered before.
So this is the first time, I'm glad you mentioned that, because this is the first time that we're going to have a live video, not just as you see me here today, but there'll be clips of me giving teaching as if we're in the same room, and I wish I could see all of you. But I think the most beautiful part of this is that we'll be looking at authentic tantric manuscripts. We'll be taking little beautiful vista views of Kashmir itself, which is one of the prominent vortexes or energetic centers for the flourishing of Tantra. And we'll be looking at translations and so forth, and various illustrations, paintings that will help to enrich our experience together in this journey.
Okay. This is kind of a big question. In your view or scheme of things, or in the krama, this lineage scheme anyway, is there a state that can be attained that is different from the normal waking human experience? Or is the human experience the state? Why do we seek something more or different, as if this human condition is somehow incomplete or inadequate? Are we fooling ourselves in trying to seek enlightenment?
Okay. Well, this is a great question, and it just so happens it fits with a verse I'd like to share in a moment. I do want to say a couple words before I, read the verse as a partial answer. What is the difference between, in terms of maintaining a householder lifestyle, between an awakened being, quote unquote, one who is a jivan mukta, as the tantrics that come from the solo matriarchal-based religion, or rather, matriarchal lineage of Tantra, known as the Krama, K-R-A-M-A. The questioner referred to this lineage, also known as the Kali Kula, or the lineage of Kali. It's strictly Kashmiri. One of its adherents, or one of its disciples, is the great Kashmiri sage Abhinavagupta, the great polymath scholar, philosopher, yogic master. And this tradition gives us this possibility, or this projected outcome of one's daily practice, which comes to us in several methods. Some reach the awakened state through this yoga practice we've been talking about, but others through a glance from their guru's eye, still others from a download that they get of divine consciousness through having a triggering through a sensual experience. But the point is that the Krama lineage shares with us that it is possible to attain, and not only possible, but we should remain open to the possibility that liberation can flower forth this heart lotus into the state of awakening at any given moment of this life. But the question is, what does the liberated state look like? Is it different than how we perceive the world? Does the world change? The first question is, does it look different from the way ordinary people not in a liberated state perceive the world? Well, yes, it looks different insofar as no longer do we see ourselves in the state of living liberation as separate waves on the ocean. That is to say, we no longer see ourselves as waves here, separate with inside an outer world that we perceive through our senses. We now see this inner world as one with the outer world, one pulsation of consciousness in which there is nothing to attain anymore, for that experience is already attained. The awakening to who we really are in this time and space flowers forth in a moment in which the mind is literally blown, chitta vritti nirodha, and no longer does the mind become the master, it now becomes a servant, as the great sage Sri Naga shares with us. But Abhinavagupta, in a poem that I've recently translated called The 15 Verses on Awakening, gives us, while reveling, I believe, in the awakened state himself, for this poem is somewhat autobiographical, he gives us the definition of the state of awakening. It goes as follows. This is verse 13, unpublished, of the Bodha Panchadashika, the 15 Verses on Awakening. Yat tattvasya pariganam samoksha parameshataha tat purnatvam prabhudanam jivan muktischa sasmrita. This is a liberated being, one who experiences reality as divine. This experience is the fulfillment of all the awakened ones, and it is known as embodied liberation. Good.
Wow.
More on that later.
This question is twofold, and it's really good. So I don't want you to be too short with it, but maybe it's one of those that will lead to more in the immersion. Who are some of the other key players, the ecstatic poets, philosophers, writers that your work draws on that you'll be presenting in the immersion? And then the second part from the same questioner is, how is this different from what I hear of another kind of tantric tradition out there, the Sri Vidya tradition?
Great question. I'm very glad you asked it, and I hope it was heard well. What's the difference between what I'm presenting and the Sri Vidya? Some of you have heard of this. Well, in short, I'm presenting an overview of the tradition that's pan-tantric. That is to say, the 8 lineages that Professor Alexis Sanderson has defined very accurately, and I do want to pause and say that I believe, or I feel that Professor Sanderson is the top scholar in the field in the world, and he's given us, or outlined for us in his 1988 article, Shaivism and the Tantric Traditions, the 8 major lineages. Amongst them, one is called the Sri Vidya. And the Sri Vidya, I'll come to in just a moment, is an offshoot of the Krama lineage that I'm going to be primarily focusing on when we get into the core philosophies of the post-tantric phase. That is to say, the tantras themselves give us a pan-tantric cross-lineage set of rituals, including the daily yoga vinyasa. Okay? Now, what we have from that is gradually, particularly in the goddess-oriented lineages of the tantric movement, we have a movement towards this terminology of living in the embodied awakened state, as Abhinavagupta just shared with us. And the poetry of the Krama lineage in particular is one in which I'll be drawing from a lot, and the key players in this lineage will be some of the core characters that are still, sadly, as of yet, unknown to us largely. We have the founding father of the Krama lineage, Sri Gyananetra, that I'll be referring to and quoting the work of, who wrote the hymn The Kali after his awakening experience in the cremation ground, where the goddess Kali, far from a demoniacal, scary-looking goddess, is now called Mangala, she who is auspicious and beautiful. How this transmission led to his state of living liberation and a practice in which we can engage, according to his teaching, the Krama teaching, we can engage the very emotions and thoughts that flow through our heads as goddesses that, when recognized for the powers that they are, can cause liberating experiences. His disciple, the first matriarch known in not just in Tantra, in Indian history, Sri Keyuravati, she who is embodied, the embodiment of the coiled power. Her disciple, Sri Hraswanatha or Viranatha, the little lord or the lord of heroes, and his famous poem, which parodies the Vijnana Bhairava Tantra, in which we can not only just reach the state of liberation through seated and postural yoga practices, but also through engaging the five senses with tremendous focus and indulgence even in the sensual immersion of sights and sounds and tastes and tactile sensations and smells in order to trigger sudden awakening. So we'll be looking at this lineage. Sri Naga, lastly, I'd like to mention him, the great author of the 30 verses on how I delight in my own awareness. He's not even giving us practices, he's just talking about what it's like to see the world from the awakened state. So these poems were meant to originally be memorized or chanted every day to trigger the awakening state. In terms of the Sri Vidya, very little is said about this lineage in the Tantras. It's a lineage that's only known to itself, and in contrast to the work of some prominent Tantra scholars today who claim that it's the most ancient, it certainly is not. We know this from the fact that its core mantras are based in the Krama lineage. That is to say, it's drawing from the Krama lineage. Abhinavagupta does not know the Sri Vidya at all, and he gives a thorough account of all other lineages, even the ones he's in conflict with. The Sri Vidya is generated no earlier than the 11th century, and it sort of catalyzes all the core teachings of the Shakta or goddess lineages that come before it. Its other name is the lineage of Tripura, or the goddess of the three worlds, or Sri Lalita, the enjoyer or the player. And it survives predominantly in South India, so any scholars that have focused their studies in South India tend to be Sri Vidya scholars. But in South India, the instantiation of it in that location has been sort of its radical rituals, of which there were many, radical rituals that challenge ideas of purity and some of the nonsense of the patriarchy. Those are whittled out or completely extracted from the version of Sri Vidya that survived in South India. So we'll look a little bit at that in the opening phases of our time together. What are the core lineages and how does the Sri Vidya sort of promulgate from them? Tried to be short on that one. It's
a
tough question. It's a big one.
Yeah.
That's a doctoral thesis in its very form. Yeah.
But it's helpful because that's kind of what the dialogue that's happening in the modern yoga world right now.
Right.
It's like Sri Vidya is centered, and this is different. So, really good question.
Good question.
So it seems like it's kind of almost time to begin wrapping up, and maybe Chris, if you wouldn't mind going over again what people can expect from the immersion, practices, experiences to walk away from,
Right.
how they will enrich their practice, and maybe I know from my standpoint as a yoga teacher, my teaching, how I can better serve.
Sure. The quick answer to this is that before my father, who again had mastered a lot of what we're talking about in terms of the core sadhana of mantra work, the very night before he left his body, he said, your goal in this life must be to share these practices with others. So my interest as a scholar is in reviving the lost components as well as the sequencing of these subtle body yoga practices and suggesting ways in which they can be tied into or can follow from a daily postural-based practice. And the bottom line is this. I don't perform personally any uchara or sound-based mantra work without doing postural yoga first. We know that the tantrics invented at some phase, or at least celebrated their liberated state through postural movement. Postural movement does not exist in any yoga school. In fact, it would have been frowned upon in the past, in pre-tantric systems. So what I want to share is the core basic sadhana of mantra pranayama work in terms of what you'll be able to take home and how to integrate these practices with your daily postural yoga. And in so doing, to actually fuse back together in a modified form that is applicable to our daily lives as Westerners. We're not trying to revive 11th century Tantra exactly as it was, but these people were onto something. Their movement spread like wildfire almost overnight and dominated India for 1,000 years before it was, more or less wiped out by foreign invasion. What were they doing? What is the antecedent to our postural practice, and what are the components that we're missing? And I'll be sharing this not just verbally in the immersion in February, but also visually. We'll be demonstrating some of the core mudras and bandhas and pranayamas so that you can see and follow at home and incorporate into your own practice.
Wow, all right. I'm looking forward to it, and I'm sure some of y'all out there are as well. So just to first say thanks for showing up and being here with us this morning or afternoon or whatever time of the day it is for you. Again, the Rise of Tantra immersion begins February 23rd, and classes are going to be spread over 2 days. Each day will have two-hour classes with a break in the middle, totaling 8 total hours of instruction. And the whole weekend will be recorded and available to view after for those who would like to join but can't commit to the whole weekend, the whole time being there. And also, again, if you sign up in the next day, we're offering 25% off, which means it's $149, and then the price will go up. So we just want to encourage you to register for the early discount until tomorrow.
I'd also like to add that one of my core motivations for doing this series, this 2-day intensive, is that it can be utilized for future teacher trainings. That is to say, as a downloadable course, because it's not only going to cover the basics of our very heritage. If you're practicing postural yoga, your heritage is, without a doubt, at least in its most direct connection, the tantric movement. So hopefully this will be something that will serve as a primer for students in teacher trainings, in which they can also correlate back to the inspirations behind Tantra. How does Patanjali's Yoga Sutra influence Hatha Yoga, etc.? So I want to thank all of you for your time, your participation, your enthusiasm. We're doing this as co-students, and I humbly and with a lot of grace in my heart, thank you for being with us. And I offer this time together next month as a way that we could all go deeper together. So is that it for questions? Nina Sahajo?
Yes, Christopher Tompkins. I believe that's it. I'm just checking back in at headquarters to see if anything else has come in, because I think we still have about 2 minutes. But I'm really excited about this upcoming course, and thanks a lot for your time.
Thank you very much from my heart to all of yours, and we'll see you next month, we hope. Namaskara, and thank you very much.